Okay. Well, as everybody recalls, if you weren't here, you hopefully were able to get caught up on the video. Last week, we finished up with chapter 3, and we had a pretty good, robust discussion about what modern day idols and idolatry can look like. And so then this week, Hosea changes to not the metaphor of Hosea and Gomer and the children, but now it's going to the application of the pretty much the same thing, but now it's going to be between God and the northern kingdom and all the people of the northern kingdom. So it's good. You're going to see a lot of repetitive type events and types of warnings and different things, but it's just going to be made to a much larger group as opposed to an individual. And as you read through these chapters and some of these verses, it's easy to think that this is talking about a current event or this is happening, but keep in mind that all of this is still a prophecy and a prediction of what's coming. So I know a lot of it could be the translation from Hebrew to English and then from the various versions that are in our Bible. But you kind of got to remember that these are all predictions and stuff, even though it makes it sound like this is happening in real time at the time this was being written. So starting with chapter 4, the writings of Hosea, like we said, now revert to the relationship between God and Israel. Hosea and Gomer kind of fade off into the sunset. We don't really hear much, if anything, about them anymore. But you have to keep remembering here that this is Hosea actually writing this and making these prophecies to the people. So a lot of this is his voice, except for the times when it appears to be God's voice. And like I said, chapter 4 through 11 start off with a lot of the accusations and warnings for the Israelite nation. More or less tells them, what you've done wrong, but here's how you can recover, and if you don't, this is going to be what befalls you. And so it starts off just like a courtroom scene or whatever, where God starts off by bringing these charges with a very broad overview. He basically gives them a basic summary of their guilt, not the actual individual sins or crimes, but he starts off by saying there's no truth in the Israelite nation. He says they wouldn't, more or less says they wouldn't know truth if it bit them in the rear end. They don't know how to speak it, and as a result, no one trusts anybody. So it doesn't matter what you say. You can't speak the truth, so why would you believe anybody else? So there's just no honesty or truth in any of their actions whatsoever. He goes on to say that there's no mercy. They're not showing compassion to any of the downtrodden, the weak. They're not showing any acts of humanity. They're not giving. There's no acts of benevolence to others. They're all about themselves. They're all being selfish and working on their own needs and things. And and then lastly, and probably what's most important, is that there's just no knowledge of God in their lives whatsoever. And by saying this, it's not that they don't know who God, they obviously know who God is, but he's not taking a preference in their life. They're not giving him any credit for the prosperity and the things that they're experiencing. If they worship him at all, they're just going through the motions and showing up on Sunday, and then at the same time they're still continuing to worship their idols, Baal and so on. But the biggest thing is they just don't have any kind of a relationship with him whatsoever, and they don't walk in fear of him. They don't fear the kinds of punishments and things like that can come down on them, because if you think about it, they've had many years of sinning and getting away with it. So, it's one of those things. It's like, even if they know they're going to get caught and get in trouble someday, they're not too worried about it because they think they've got a buffer zone where they can get away with this. And this fact of committing all these crimes and everything that you'll hear about here soon, it kind of reminds you of what's going on in our major cities today, where police budgets have been slashed. A lot of cities say if it's less than $1,000, it's a misdemeanor, and we're not even going to show up. So thieves just walk into drugstores and department stores and everything, and they pick up $995 worth of clothing and just walk out in broad daylight. And everybody, instead of trying to stop them, they just hold up their cell phone and record it. And the other day, there was even a rape on a subway, and instead of 10 people jumping on the guy and pulling him off, they get out their phones. So it's a shame that what some of our major cities have become today is probably not unlike what God was trying to point out in Hosea in this time. So then God starts going into the details about the crimes committed, and he mentions swearing and stealing and murder and so on, and he starts trying to point out that basically he says that the actions of the Israel nation are kind of like animals run amok or whatever. There's just no controlling them. They don't know any boundaries. There's no fences holding them in, whether it be mental or physical. And that kind of reminds you of some of the riots we saw in several of the cities as well too, where the looting and the pillaging and burning of cars and businesses and buildings and everything, and just the crimes against humanity were, it wasn't even safe to walk the streets. People were just beating and running people over and everything else. That some of the movies that you see nowadays seem to be coming to life. And that's what Hosea and was trying to describe what was going on back then. But then Hosea gives God's warning that as a result of this, the land is going to suffer and be devastated. It's going to be much like a drought, with no food or water. And it says with no food, some of the verses even say that because they will not have food and water, the people of Israel will be weakened. They will basically waste away, and they won't. Not only will they not be able to grow any crops and stuff, but their reliance on animals and fish and so on for sustenance as well too, that's all going to be taken away from them. And so there's a lot of warnings there in that. And then verse 4 starts getting into and it doesn't do any good to rebuke these people or contend with them, because that's all they do anyway. There's a constant arguing amongst the people, and they will even argue with the priests. And we'll talk quite a bit about the priests a little bit later and have a question on it. But some others have argued that this is also a criticism of the priests, because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're shirking or violating their responsibility. They're not teaching the people. Here's Hosea standing up and speaking as a prophet, but all of the priests in these cities and regions and stuff should be also saying all of this, and they're not doing it. So they're just as culpable, even if they're not, physically committing the crime. It's just their Chuck Mishler once said in one of his commentaries that the actions in Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't the real sin. It was the condoning of the actions that was the major sin in Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is kind of the same way here, that the priests are just as guilty committing the crimes just because they're standing back watching and not doing their part to teach the word and stop this. And it's pointed out, and there's a lot of metaphors in here too, that says that the people's lack of knowledge of God will cause them to stumble even in the daytime. You expect to stumble or trip over things in the dark when it's not well lit, but in broad daylight, when you trip over something, you feel really, really bad, really stupid sometimes. So he's saying that, even with under the brightest of lights, you're still going to trip up and make mistakes. And God states that everyone's going to struggle, including the priests, the prophets, and the mother. And the mother reference is likely the reference to the nation of Israel, or simply anyone that was in leadership at that time, because they're the ones that are setting the tone of how people should and can act and in the region. And then even though all of the prosperity and everything has been allowed to happen by God, it says the people were taking God's blessings for granted, and they only sinned against God all the more because, again, here's that cause and effect thing. They're sinning, and yet they're still being blessed. So they don't think that continuing to sin is going to take away from that. So they're going to just sin all the more. And while it's obvious, while it's good to be blessed, whether it's by God or they presume it to be by their other idols and everything, it does also bring more accountability and more opportunity for sin, because they're being enriched from it, and that gives them the opportunity to commit even more sins. We mentioned the priests a little bit. The priests also enjoyed the benefit of the people's sins. If you remember, when people sin, they would bring offerings to the temples and give them to the priests and things, whether it be in the form of meats or breads or whatever the grains that they were going to offer. So the priests are actually being enriched by the wickedness and that kind of stuff, because the more people sin, the more they're going to come and give their offerings to the priests. So they're getting just as rich, or getting their tax, so to speak. And it kind of reminds you a little bit of our government and that kind of stuff, that if we can't figure out a way to outlaw something, well, we're going to legalize it and tax it so we can get some revenue off of it. And that's a lot of that was going on in this time in the northern kingdom as well. Now the priests may have thought that they would be immune from the judgment coming upon Israel, because after all, they're priests, they're God's chosen people to lead people. But God promises that when it does come to judgment, everyone's going to be fair game. It's not going to be just the source of the crimes and that kind of stuff, that everybody is going to be in that area of being judged. And but God kind of talks about his judgment. It's almost as if we had the conversation about money is an idol today, of how much is too much. God kind of promises that in Israel they will always seem to be hungry. They'll eat till the point where they're ready to burst, but they're still not satisfied. It doesn't seem to be enough. And that's what happens with a lot of people in their wealth and things that they collect or whatever nowadays. They never get to a point where they can say, okay, I'm done, I'm finished, I can go on to something else. They just keep on because it seems to be so easy. Then the next several verses in chapter 4 discuss their infatuation with idols. And it's really kind of described as being an addiction that they can't get away from. Once they start worshiping these idols and stuff, it kind of enslaves them to the point that they have to continue in worshiping. And it reminded me kind of another. We came up with about 10 or so different top idols that people worship. This kind of reminded me of another one. Today, it seems like our focus on government and people that rely on government to make ends meet and that kind of stuff is a form of idolatry that we didn't really discuss. But the conversations now where we want to expand all of these social programs and everything and just give people money, whether you're an immigrant coming over the border that possibly getting a big check, or you just stay home and check your mailbox every day. Reliance on government seems to be a form of idolatry today that we had not discussed. And verses 13 and 14 kind of make it known that there's no place that's immune from idol worship. Those verses say that they worship on mountaintops and hillsides and under just about every kind of shade tree that you could find. So they didn't always just go to the temples or to the places where they thought they had to go worship. They were worshiping everywhere. And so basically anyone, there wasn't anybody that was more to blame than the others. Everybody was pretty much doing it. And it was getting so bad in the northern kingdom that God even kind of warns Judah, the southern kingdom, that you need to stay away from the northern kingdom and don't follow in their sinful ways, lest you fall as well. And we've talked before how even though Judah was kind of on the same path, they weren't quite as bad as the northern kingdom, at least at this time. That's partly because there was still a lot of deep belief in a lot of people that followed David and his line. But God had made promises to David about the role that they would play in the future. So God was hopeful and trying to trust that Judah was going to be a little bit better than the northern kingdom. So he's just kind of cautioning them or warning them to stay away. It starts referencing certain cities and that kind of stuff. Gilgal, for example. Gilgal at once was a place where prophets were trained under Elijah and Elisha, but what used to be considered to be a holy place or a place where a lot of good things were happening, it had actually become a center of idol worship and false worship. So it's interesting how you'll see another example of that here in a minute, where what was meant to be for a good cause or a good reason, even those places kind of fell into disarray as well. Hosea uses the words Beth Aven. Some people have commented that there might have been a separate town called Beth Aven, but most think that Hosea is twisting the name of the city of Bethel. Bethel means the house of God, but by changing it to Beth Aven, he's changed the description or to the house of deceit, or some, as we've talked, a Hebrew word can have many, many different connotations. Aven could also mean disaster and wickedness, but in all senses of the word, it's the house of something negative. There's nothing really good coming out of Bethel, which used to be the house of God. Now it's becoming the house of deceit. So it's probably fine that God rather didn't have his name on some of these cities and that kind of stuff, because they obviously didn't represent what he meant or should have meant to the people. God then also begins to describe a few metaphors on how he's just going to give Ephraim the ability to make their mistakes and wander alone and unprotected. First, he he kind of likens them to a stubborn cow. You know, cows for the most part can go out into the fields and that kind of stuff and stay as a group and survive and protect themselves, where sheep, on the other hand, almost always needed some sort of a shepherd or whatever to help keep them herded together and protected. But God says he's going to let them act like stubborn cows, and that they shouldn't expect then to be protected like an obedient sheep. And then that verse further goes on to say, they've taken up idolatry. He's going to leave them alone. He's not going to make their corrections for them. He's going to give them the opportunity to pass or fail. Verse 18 is a kind of another metaphor where some Bibles say their wine has gone sour. Some say the drink is gone or the wine is gone. But basically he's saying when they run out of liquor, so to speak, that they're going to turn to other types of sin and still continue to commit other forms of idolatry and adultery and everything, and they just don't have any shame. They're not even doing it behind closed doors. They're just being open with this. Everybody knows what's going on. Verse 19 in chapter also talks about a great wind is going to wrap them up in their wings. Some have interpreted this that their enemy, the Assyrians, are going to come in like a great wind and take them away, and that they will be ashamed when their idols don't protect them or stand up and save them. So they're going to realize that the gods that they have been worshiping are not going to be able to prevent them from falling to these various warnings and so on. So one of the random questions that I have for everybody today is, a couple of the verses in chapter 4 make it clear that God's not going to intervene on their northern kingdom's half. And we kind of discussed this a little bit in Job last time around. But it's still, whether it's the book of Job or this here, it evokes a very common question that people ask all the time is why does God sit back and let things like this happen? And so I was wanting to see if anybody recalls what we discussed in Job, or simply why do you think God's just going to sit back and observe and watch the direction that the northern kingdom's going in?
Well, I think it's because God is God, and he will do whatever he chooses to do.
I think it's to make us realize how much we need God.
Well, one of the things we talked about too is that God gave us all free will and the ability, and God allows these temptations to be put in front of us so that we can make decisions and stuff. And then that makes it our decision and not God's decision. If God is going to simply just take care of us and take the decision away from us, then all of the actions are really God's and not ours. So how can we pass or fail if we're not allowed to make our own decisions? So it comes back to that whole free will thing, that it reveals character and things. And so I think that was my interpretation or my thought, that how we react to, whether it's something like what happened to Job, how we react is our free will. But otherwise, we're just a bunch of robots that God is controlling, and we don't have a soul, I guess, at that point, if we don't have a say in where we go. So, any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, hearing none. Lost my cursor. There it is. Did I go one too many?
I kind of thought you just kind of reap what you sow kind of analogy.
Yeah. I can't back up. Oh, let me use the other keyboard. There we go. Okay. Sorry, I lost control for a minute. Next, our scriptures go on to talking about the judgment on Israel and Judah. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about the priests a little bit more. It's seeing the sinful state of the northern kingdom. God calls out the priests and the leadership for their role in the decline. He doesn't put it all on the people because, I think as we talked in the very beginning, if your leadership and everybody cracks the whip on you and tells you how you should act and things like that, the people wouldn't be doing these things if it wasn't condoned and overlooked. And while it would be tempting for the priest to hold their hands up and say, well, it's not my fault, it's them. They're the ones that are committing all of these sins. But it was really the fault in this situation, the spiritual leadership being the priests and the political leaders, meaning the kings or the house of Israel, that were not only I would say ignoring, but they were condoning and to some degrees were probably even pushing these kind of things because like we said, from a prosperity standpoint, the country was doing great, but the house was, what's the saying that a fish rots from the head down. And so no truer of a statement could be said today. There's a couple of references here to Mizpah and Tabor. Those were two great mountains that were on either side of the Jordan River. And these were known as places where hunters and people that were pursuing animals and birds and stuff would go. They would go up into the mountains and spread snares and nets and trap birds and animals. So Hosea and God here are likewise saying that the leaders have snared the people into idolatry. It's almost like they've set them up to fail. So they're using that metaphor there as well too. And the real tragedy of Israel's sin wasn't that they stumbled. It was more that even when they realized that they were stumbling, they didn't respond to God's rebuke when they did stumble or when they were going to stumble. But if they had humbly responded to God's correction instead of ignoring him, God could have worked with them and led them back to the straight and narrow, so to speak. So question number 2 said it's easy to understand how a king might lead the people into idolatry because when you think about it, the king a lot of times would get a tax of people's wealth and everything, or part of their herd or their animals and things. So they stood to profit or to grow and gain as a result of this. But now we did mention that the priests stood to gain as well too. But if priests were truly priests and believers of God, why do you think the priests in the northern kingdom were failing to teach the people about God's warning and heed the prophet's messages? Well, the answer is in a chapter we haven't studied yet. In Second Chronicles, when they first arrived there in the land with Joshua, and every tribe got their own allotment of land. You remember that the Levites did not get an allotment of land. the Levites were given roles in the cities. The Levites became the priests throughout all of Israel, and they were spread all over both the northern and southern kingdoms, and they ran the temples and everything. So the Levites, who were the priests in the original times, were truly priests of the Lord and believed in God. In Second Chronicles, when the house of David split and Jeroboam the first and Rehoboam went off and created their own separate kingdoms and divided into the north and the south, all of the Levites left the northern kingdom and went to Jerusalem and Judah. They all went to the south. They gave up their possessions and everything that they had and just migrated south, because Jeroboam did not support them as the Lord's priests. So all of the truly devoted priests went to the Judah and to the south, and which could have helped contribute to the fact that Judah seemed to do a little bit better than everybody else. So then the kings of the north had no choice, but then they just took common men and ordained them or made them into priests. So they didn't become priests because they were believers or they were descendants of the Levites. They just got appointed to be priests. So they probably didn't have the training. They weren't raised to be priests. One day they were a carpenter, next day they were a priest. So they probably weren't the best representatives for the priests, and that's one of the things that probably contributed to the downfall of the northern kingdom a little bit quicker. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, well, then our scripture goes on to talk about too little, too late. Israel's rebellion was kind of centered on pride and arrogance. They thought that what they were doing was fine, that it was working for them, and they were just kind of thumbing their nose up to if the priests were trying to teach, they were being ignored. The prophets, as we mentioned before, prophets were not the most well-respected people. They just were looked at like somebody in the town square, crying out and that kind of stuff. But they also pointed out here too that Judah was also starting to stumble as well too. But in chapter 5, verse 6, the kingdoms are starting to feel a little bit desperate, and they're trying to buy their way out of their iniquity. It says that they're going to bring their flocks and herds to the temples and so forth, and they're going to try and sacrifice their way out of it. We've talked about that in the past, that, just showing up and then giving a donation or your tithe is not enough. But here they were hoping to sacrifice their way out of it, and they make a superficial gesture of repentance. It's just, well, I'm going to give them some cows and sheep and some grain, and then I'll be okay. But at this point, the Lord has already withdrawn from them, and he's not even there to accept this. Israel's leaders and all the people of Israel had basically produced a generation of children that knew nothing about God. All they knew was the worship of pagan idols and the Baals and so forth. And you can kind of see a little bit of a similarity in this next part, as we saw with Gomer. Remember, in Gomer, it said that Hosea was going to take away all of her festivities and her celebrations. Here again, now it's saying the same thing for the Israelites. God would send another wave of judgments and end their traditional new moon festivals with destruction. So, normally the new moon every month was a time of celebration and celebrating the growth of crops and children and so forth. It says that God's, going to show them that the error of their ways and start punishing them on those new moons instead of celebrating. There was also a lot of warnings. Again, reading these scriptures, sometimes it makes it sound like we're seeing this in real time. But again, these are all still prophecies. It says verses 8 and 9 prophesied that a battle is coming and that the northern kingdom will be laid to waste. It talks about blowing the horns and trumpets in Gibeah and Ramah, and people shouting out and crying in Bethaven. These were all symbols that a opposing army was near. But of course, this was a prophecy. They weren't there at the time, but this is just Hosea saying there's going to be a time when you're going to blow the horns and so forth. And I looked up these three cities, Gibeah, Ramah, and Bethaven, and then it also mentions Benjamin. Benjamin was actually a region. It was given a small allotment of land that was between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. It was kind of on the border. And I don't know if there's any, real reason why these were chosen, but it almost makes it look like they're going to be attacked in the border. From a tactical standpoint, then people could assume, well, maybe it's the south attacking the north and the north attacking the south, when it's really the Assyrians or the Babylonians coming in from the east. But just thought it was interesting that they actually picked a location where this would happen. And our scriptures say that while these warnings seem to be meant for both of the kingdoms, Ephraim the northern kingdom seemed to get the worst of it. He even kind of talks how Judah was more like thieves that were stealing land. If you remember, when you move boundaries, you're moving survey markers, and when you move a survey marker, you're stealing people's land through tricks. And so it sounds like they're trying to point out that while Judah is kind of on the path, they're not quite as bad as Ephraim. So they're still kind of getting a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. But Ephraim, on the other hand, was completely lost, and they didn't follow any of the laws. They followed man rather than God. So the judgment for both of these kingdoms was going to be different in the beginning, but ultimately they're both going to get the same kind of judgment, just going to be on a different schedule. If you remember, Judah doesn't fall for about 120 years after Ephraim. So it also uses a couple more metaphors. God says that to Ephraim, he's going to be like a moth, and to Judah, like rottenness. And what one can glean from this is that the moth will eat and destroy things from the surface where it can be seen and be obvious, where the rottenness kind of degrades from the inside. You just don't realize it until it's too late. So, but it was predicted that once Ephraim realized that they're weak in state, they still didn't turn to God immediately. Typically, like even in the times of Judah or Judges, once people realized that they were being oppressed or in danger or just in very bad condition, they would always repent and turn back to God. In this situation, they didn't turn to God. Instead, they reached out to the Assyrian, said they would reach out to the Assyrian king. And our verses make reference to a King Jareb. All the commentaries and research that I did, there really was no king named Jareb, but Jareb could have either been a place, it could have been the king from Jareb, or it could just be the transliteration of Jareb king, which is warrior. Jareb means warrior, so it could be the warrior king. So no matter what, they were reaching out to the Assyrians for relief and stuff instead of repenting of their sins and reaching out to God. So even though they were told what they were going to need to do, they didn't do it still. So, and of course the outreach didn't solve the issue. But then if you read on into our verses about, what's going to come or more, their verses kind of say that while the moth would cause a subtle long-term destruction, the lion, it said that the lion would basically shred them to pieces and things. The lion's going to be an obvious and swift harm. So when they show up, you're going to know it. And it's not something I can take care of this later. Judah, depending on which Bible version you read, it says that Judah was, some Bibles just say a great lion. My Bible, King James Version, said that it was going to get a young lion. So I kind of interpreted it that, here's the king of the jungle, the big adult lions and stuff is going to go into Ephraim and basically just tear him to shreds. The young lion's still learning, he doesn't have the strength or the teeth and that kind of stuff. He's just still kind of playing with his food. So I kind of interpreted this that Judah, you're gonna get a break here. You're not going to get the same punishment. It's going to be painful, but it's not going to be as bad as the punishment that Ephraim's going to get.
Ken?
Yes, sir.
I'm seeing a parallel all through these verses, and I can't remember what they're called. Maybe somebody can help me out. In government, the people that go in and they actually bribe government to form policy that benefits their business. What are they called?
Lobbyists.
Lobbyists.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm seeing here. These are lobbyists that are encouraging their own ideas rather than God's ideas. I mean, if you look back at everything we've been talking about, or you've been teaching on here, that's what everything's shown me. Even the last verse you just had up here, not there now, is it? But anyway, it was, it just reminds, I'm seeing parallels all through it because things are being, they're not being done out in the open. So while the moth would cause subtle long-term destruction, isn't that what a lobbyist is doing? Pretty much is doing for their own benefit.
Yeah, no, you're right. And some people, unless you've watched a lot of documentaries and that kind of stuff, I mean, some of the things that have happened, and we're straying here a little bit, but the sugar industry was one of the worst lobbyists out there. And what they did got government to help their industry and that kind of stuff and sell sugar, caused harm to millions and millions of people and that kind of stuff. I mean, you look now, I mean, West Virginia's got, depending on which study you read, 70% obesity rate and that kind of stuff. And the biggest, and I don't know if Mark's still on here, and I can testify the harm that sugar does to your body and that kind of stuff, whether it's type 1, type 2 diabetes and having to be able to track that, but it leads to strokes and heart attacks and everything else. But so yeah, you're making a good point here, and it doesn't stop with sugar. I mean, there's tobacco, alcohol, and now it's marijuana and opioids, drug industries, everything else. So yeah, you're right. I mean, government working behind the scenes can get government to do things that they don't know what it does until later on in life. And when you think about that and what our country's going through right now with the things that are being not just pushed, but mandated and forced on the people, and we don't know what harm this can cause 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So that's a really good application, David.
Hey, Ken, I have a different question. I'm going back to the moth and the rottenness. And
Right.
so I didn't see that, by the way. Thank you. I didn't see that illustration of the moth consuming from the outside. But then the version about Judah that we have says, I'll make Judah as weak as rotten wood. To me, that's different than degrading from the inside, like becoming rotten. It was about them being weak. So I don't know. I'm struggling with that. Do you have comment to
Well,
it?
Yeah, I read a few commentaries on that where on the rottenness, it was talking about these worms or whatever that could bore into wood or into bones, for example. And so think about your deck on the side of your house or your bone cancer or whatever. It's rotting you from the inside out, but you don't really know it. You're being weakened, but you don't know it until one day either your bones break and then you go get an x-ray or your deck just collapses. I mean, a deck can look perfectly fine, but because of termites or whatever or rottenness, one day it just falls down and you didn't even know it was to that point because all of the rot and stuff was on the inside. So that was one person's interpretation. And so I think you're right. Whether it's really a moth or whatever, some have said it was maggots and different things. Again, one Hebrew word can mean 10 different things, but I likened it to Ephraim should have seen it coming, where Judah might have been all asleep when it was coming, was the way I envisioned it.
Yeah, I get it. That helped me. Thank you. We also struggled, well, Logan and I, on the verses just before that, 8 and 9. We felt like we were back in Job a little bit because there was just inherent sarcasm in it. And it's hard to figure out sometimes when it's being sarcastic and it's being true. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about chapter 5, verses 8 and 9?
Yes, right before that moth and rotten wood section, where like it says, lead on into battle, O warriors of Benjamin. So like if that was taken out of context, you would have thought that God was encouraging them, right? But I don't think that's what's happening. I think there's sarcasm there. Like keep doing what you're doing and there's going to be bad things that happen. But it's really hard to decipher it from my perspective. Anybody else having that trouble?
Well, in my New King James Version, verse 8 says, blow the ram's horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, cry aloud at Bethaven, look behind you, O Benjamin. And so some of the things that I had read said, it was more or less saying, look, Ephraim, your destruction is coming. It's coming near. Get ready. And so that was what I had read and understood, was that the enemy wasn't even in sight, but this is a prophecy trying to warn them that it's going to come, and if you don't change your ways. So does that help?
Yeah, it does help, because watch your back is what you just said, is very
Yeah.
different than lead on into battle, O warriors of Benjamin. So yeah, it helped. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the difficulty of, somebody translates Hebrew into English, and then all our different Bible versions all try to do it a completely different way and say, well, here's what I think they meant and stuff. I don't know which one's right or correct. You almost have to go back to the original Hebrew text. And I'll tell you that takes a long time to do, but I'm trying to see if my Bible even had, yeah, my Bible didn't go on any further, but I thought that the verse, look behind you, O Benjamin, that kind of helped me understand it, that hey, you don't know, but they're sneaking up on you, And so I think you're right. That kind of helps clear that up, as opposed to you need to be on the offense instead of defense. I think was kind of what your version was interpreting.
Mm.
Okay. Number 13, just more of the lion metaphors and that kind of stuff. It basically talks like how the lion has glutted itself and has the ability to walk away and come back, but eventually it says that he will drag the uneaten parts back to his den and so forth. Many have interpreted that to mean that when Assyria comes in, whatever it doesn't eat and destroy right then, they're going to take the rest into captivity and take them back to Assyria. So this was a prediction of that. One of the commentaries that I had read, even, and I don't know how to back that up yet, if it's in some other documents or whatever that's not in the Bible, but it said that they would actually put the captives on a rope with a fish hook in their lip, and they had to keep up or else. And that's how they led them back to Assyria and things. So, I don't know how much more you could be beaten down than to be treated like that. And like we said with Gomer, you got to hit rock bottom before you can start to rise up. So maybe that was their thing. But Hosea is still kind of telling them that once you realize your mistaken ways, and then eventually they're going to seek God, and they should have sought God. If let's assume this was real time. If I'm a nation and I go to a neighboring nation and say, hey, can you take it easy on us? Can you give us a little bit of a break here? If that is a warring type nation, they would have envisioned that outreach as weakness and said, there's no better time than to go in there and take control of them and that kind of stuff. I mean, they're instead of turning to God, they made their punishment even worse by going to the people that were going to take them into captivity. So it just shows you that not listening to God's instructions and stuff can really come back to haunt you. But again, that was the goal of God's judgment, was against Israel. The goal wasn't to totally destroy them, but to actually take them down to the lowest of lows so that they could be restored later. So hope to make it through the rest of chapter 6, but it's 10 o'clock. So I think I'll give a minute or two here to see if anybody has any comments of what we talked about here so far. And if not, we'll go to final prayer.
Wanted to tell everybody also that I did not tell that Pam Davis did make it home. Did I tell everybody that last week?
You told us that last week, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Just want to make sure, because that's a big praise.
Yep. Okay. Well, no final comments. Mike, would you mind leading us in final prayer today?
Sure, Ken.
Thank
So
you.
bow our heads. Heavenly Father, just thank you again for just the many blessings of today. Just thank you for this group, and thank you for this discussion today. Just help us to absorb that into our life and going forward, just to share it with our people we come in contact with and people we work with. Thank you for your son, Lord Jesus, and what he's done for us, and just be with us through this coming week. And thank you again for all you do. In your name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mike.
Sherry, you make the whole room look brighter. I want you to know that. And